The Refuge. Chapter 1. The meeting. Marta had been driving for hours. The empty road cut the desert in half, like a scar on the dried and dusty earth. Her eyes burned with tiredness, and the night threatened to swallow the sky completely. There was no car in sight, nor a gas station in the last 50 kilometers. Her mind was beginning to wander, rambling over the choices that led her there. She had not planned to escape, but certain things happen without warning. A break. A betrayal. A mistake that could never be undone. The cheap hotel where she had spent the last night made her feel observed, vulnerable. He needed a safer place where he could hide from his own thoughts and anyone who could be looking for him. It was when he saw the license plate on the roadside, Colleen Refuge, available rooms. The signing swayed gently in the wind, like a promise of rest. Marta slowed down and turned the steering wheel toward the small land entrance to the hostel. The Refuge was an old wood house with a balcony that looked somewhat abandoned. The peeled painting, the dirty windows. It seemed that no one had been there for years, but the lights were lit. There was something disturbing in that house, but tiredness was stronger than his intuition. She parked the car and got out, feeling the fresh air of the night. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the distant sound of crickets and the wind howling through the trees. Martha hesitated for a moment, looking at the front door, before finally raising courage and knocking on. After a few seconds, the door was opened slowly. A man appeared, tall and thin, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Can I help?" he asked, his low voice, almost too smooth. "I need a room, just a night," Marta said, forcing a smile. The man nodded, opening the door more. "Of course, we have rooms. Enter, please." The interior of the house seemed even older than the outside, with furniture that resembled another era, and the smell of mold was discreet but constant. The man took a key from the counter and led Martha to a narrow hall. The room in the background. "It's quiet." He smiled again, but this time, there was something in his eyes. Something that made her feel a chill. "Thank you," Marta said, trying to ward off the sense of discomfort that surrounded her. The man watched her every movement, and she knew that. When he closed the bedroom door, he took a deep breath, leaning against the wall. The silence weighed. Something in that place made her feel like she was being observed. But was it just tiredness, or your mind preaching pieces? She walked to the window and opened it, trying to let a little fresh air, but the view was only from the dark hill under the weak light of the moon. Maybe she was safe there, far from the problems that tormented her. At least for one night. Or maybe that place kept worse secrets than anyone she has ever known. Are you enjoying the story? Subscribe and share to find out what is coming. Chapter 2. The Owner. After leaving Martha in the room, the man silently descended the wooden stairs, which ranked lightly under his feet. The smile had disappeared from his face, replaced by a dark expression. He walked to a small room in the back of the house, where a lamp of weak light illuminated the walls covered with old black and white photos. He sat in a worn armchair, lighting a cigarette. The Hill Refuge did not receive guests frequently. In fact, he would rather not come. But when they appeared, like Martha, he knew he had no choice. It was fate, he said to himself, a cycle that could not be broken. He looked at one of the pictures on the wall of a young woman with long black hair and a penetrating look. She had been her last guest, a long time ago. Long time. His fingers tightened the arm of the armchair, and he murmured to himself. "It's just for one night." Upstairs, Martha was trying to settle. The room was simple, but the bed looked comfortable enough. The tiredness was beginning to dominate her, and she lay down, but her mind was still restless. Something was wrong there. Something in man's eyes, in the way he spoke. Or maybe it was just your paranoia following you since your escape. Memories of their last weeks have returned as a whirlwind. The lies, the fights, the impulsive decision to escape everything. Did she know that someone was looking for her, but there, in the end of the world, who would find her? Maybe I was just exaggerating. The Refuge seemed forgotten by the world. Upon hearing a creak in the hall, his heart fired. He tried to convince himself that it was just the old floor, but the feeling of being observed came back in full force. Suddenly a sharp sound of something metallic echoed through the hallway. As if someone was moving in a door or locking it. Martha was silent, listening. Silence came back, but fear remained. She got up slowly and went to the door. He leaned his ear and heard nothing. He turned around, but at that moment a shadow passed through the door crack, moving quickly. Your heart shot. Is there anyone there? She asked, trying not to sound terrified. No answer. Maybe it was the owner of the hostel, but she couldn't be sure. Maybe he was checking the rooms, or something else. But why? Marta knew she couldn't sleep. Not until I found out what was happening there. What did that man hide? The suspense is just starting. Subscribe and share so as not to lose the next twists. Now, let me know if I can continue the story. Chapter 3. The Attic. Marta was still for a few seconds, her eyes fixed on the door crack. The feeling of being observed was almost tangible, as if someone was right there, waiting for a movement. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the heart that beat in the chest. Perhaps I was imagining things, tiredness distorting reality. But that sound, it was too real to be the result of your tired mind. Determined to end the restlessness, Marta took the door handle with trembling hands and turned her slowly. The hallway was dark, with just a thread of weak light from the bottom floor. The silence, which once seemed normal, was now oppressive. She stepped ahead, watching the way ahead. Everything seemed in order, but something in the air made her hesitate. That was when he saw a slightly open wooden door at the end of the hall, revealing a steep staircase. Marta frowned. He didn't remember noticing that door before. His instinct shouted not to move on, but something stronger, perhaps curiosity or desire to understand what was going on, pushed her into the attic. She climbed the steps in silence, her steps drowned out of the dust that rose with each step. Upon reaching the top, he found a small illuminated room, full of old boxes and sheets covered with sheets. The smell of mold was stronger there, and the air seemed heavy, as if it was still for decades. In the corner of the room, something caught his attention, a large swing chair, slightly tilted forward, as if someone had just gotten up. Next to the chair, a bedside table with a dusty picture frame. Marta approached slowly, her fingers touching the cold frame. As he cleaned the dust of the glass, he saw the image of a woman, the same she had seen in the photos hanging in the downstairs room. The woman in the portrait seemed haunted, her forced smile, her sad eyes. Martha felt a shiver walking through her spine. Who was she? And why did the men who took care of the refuge kept so many pictures of her scattered around her house? Suddenly the sound of steps echoed along the stairs behind her. Your body froze. Someone was rising. She looked around, desperately looking for a place to hide, but the space was so crowded that it would be impossible to hide without being seen. The steps approached, stronger every second. Marta retreated slowly to the wall, her breath rapidly, her eyes fixed on the door. When the figure appeared at the top of the stairs, Martha arrested her breath. It was the man, the owner of the inn. He stood at the entrance, his fixed gaze on her, without blinking. The disturbing smile he had shown before was back, but now it seemed even more sinister. I said this room was quiet, no? He said, in a tone that seemed at the same time calm and threatening. Martha felt the cold sweat drain through her neck. She needed to get out of there, but she didn't know how. The moon blocked the only way out, and didn't seem inclined to let her go so easily. What do you want? She asked, her weaker voice than she expected. He did not respond immediately. He just stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers. Some things should stay where they are. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. Marta knew at that moment that she was in danger. She needed to escape. But the attic seemed less and smaller, and the men, getting closer and closer. The tension only increases. Subscribe and share to find out what Martha will do next. Chapter 4. Fleeing in the darkness. Marta didn't wait anymore. When the men took another step toward him, she moved quickly, grabbing an old chair beside her and pushing her hard against him. The chair hit his chest, making him stagger for a moment. It was the breach she needed. Without thinking twice, Marta ran toward the stairs. His feet quickly descended the steps, the sound of his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The men recovered too fast for his taste, and she could hear her furious steps behind her, down the stairs. She arrived at the hallway and ran toward the front door, her heart hammering in her ears. But when she tried to rotate the doorknob, she didn't move. Locked. Marta looked desperate around, seeking an alternative outlet. That's when he saw another door, ajar, leading to a part that she had not explored from the house. With no time to hesitate, she pushed the door tightly and ran down a new, narrower, moisture-smelling corridor. The lighting was virtually non-existent, and she could barely see where she was going, but she needed to stay in motion. The sound of man's footsteps echoed around the house, closer and closer. He would not give up so easily. She knew that if he caught her, he would have no chance of defending herself. He seemed to know that maze of corridors much better than her, and the darkness was his ally. Marta turned a corner and came across a window. Your heart leaned into hope. If you could open the window and leave the side of the house, you might escape. She forced the window lock with all her might, but was rusty and resistant. Her fingers were sweaty, and the adrenaline made her movements look more clumsy. Suddenly, a sound behind her made it freeze. The man was there, at the end of the corridor, his threatening silhouette against the low light that came from somewhere behind him. You shouldn't have left the room, he said, his voice sounding more like an accusation than a warning. Martha, in pure despair, gave one last push in the window, which finally gave way with a metallic creak. Without thinking, she passed her, feeling the cold air of the night on her face. It was dark outside, but freedom was just a few meters away. She threw herself into the darkness, running without looking back, her feet barely touching the floor. He needed to reach the car, but the refuge, with his shadows and hills, seemed to want to keep her stuck there forever. She could hear the men screaming something behind her, but the wind and the fear pushed her forward. Away from that place. Away from that man who followed her with a determination she didn't understand, but feared deeply. Marta managed to escape? Or isn't it? Subscribe and share to find out what is coming. Would you like to continue with the next chapters? Chapter 5. The Revelation. The cold air of the night cut Martha's face as she ran toward the car, her heart fired, pulsing like a drum in her ears. The shadows of the surrounding trees seemed to lengthen, like hands they tried to reach it. The refuge of the hill, with its threatening aura, seemed to observe it from afar, as if the house itself was alive, waiting for the right time to claim it back. When she finally arrived in the car, her trembling hands could barely hold the keys. She dropped them to the dusty floor. "No!" shouted in his mind, hurriedly bending to pick them up. As he got up, he saw the men emerge from the shadows, walking toward him with a frightening calm, as if he knew she had nowhere to run away. Marta got into the car, turning the key to the ignition. The engine coughed, but did not get it. "Come on, let's go," murmured desperate, turning the key again. Again, the car refused to call. Your heart seemed about to explode from so much panic. The man was already close enough so she could see the disturbing glow in her eyes. He carried something in his hands, something that reflected the low light of the moon, a large, heavy English key. Marta tried once more, spinning the key with all her strength, and this time the engine roared alive. She released the brake and accelerated, shot the dirt road. As the car scunned over the boulders, Marta looked at the rear-view mirror. The men stood in the middle of the road, immovable, watching her with the same sinister smile that was now recorded in her mind. Even at a distance, she could see something strange about him, something that made her tremble. He didn't look scared or angry. It seemed pleased. After a few minutes of pure adrenaline, Marta finally reduced the speed. The lights of the refuge were left behind, but the sense of danger not. The silence around was disturbing. She kept driving down the deserted road, but something inside her said it was not over yet. He decided to stop at a small convenience store he found on the way. Neon's light flashed, illuminating an empty parking lot. Marta entered quickly, looking for the cashier, which was on the phone, with an bored expression. Seeing her, he raised his eyes, realizing his state of agitation. "Are you okay, girl?" he asked, with his eyes worried. Martha looked around, still trying to process everything that had happened. I just got out of a hostel there on the road. The refuge of the hill. Something strange is happening there. There's a man. He tried to hurt me." The cashier, a middle-aged man, frowned. He looked confusing. "The refuge of the hill? This cannot be." He paused, analyzing her words. That hostel was closed for years. After the old owner? Well, there was a tragedy there. Martha felt her stomach turn. What? What do you mean with closed? The man sighed, looking reluctant to tell the story. The owner of the place, a woman named Beatrice, died almost 20 years ago. He lived with his son, a strange guy, was always inmate. After her death, no one else heard of him. They say he kept living there, but no one has ever known. Police even investigated, but never found anything concrete. But I was there. The place was working. He gave me a room. It was there now. Martha insisted, feeling on the edge of a collapse. The man shook his head slowly. I don't know what you saw, girl, but that place has been abandoned for years. There is no one there. His words fell like a weight on Martha. There is no one there. But she had seen the men. He felt his presence, heard his steps. Something very wrong was happening. Marta left the store, feeling the world around her. He sat on the driver's seat, trying to calm his breath. But all I could think was the men, and what he had said before she escaped. Some things should remain where they are. What was he hiding in that place? And, more importantly, who was he? Want to know the outcome of this chilling story? Subscribe and share to find out what Martha will find out next. Chapter 6. The Return. Martha could not ward off the thought of refuge. The words of the cashier echoed in his mind, mixed in the image of men in the hall and the feeling of being observed. Something deeper called her back, an inexplicable need to understand what was really happening. She knew it would be dangerous, that any sensible person would move on and never look back, but she couldn't. Something arrested her to that place. She drove along the dark road, the lighthouse of the car illuminating the way back to the hill refuge. As he approached, the place seemed even more sinister, wrapped in the fog. The house seemed bigger, more imposing than before, as if the darkness had increased its size. Marta parked the car away, enough so that the sound of the engine was not heard. He got out of the car and walked with caution. The silence was even heavier than the first time, and the night breeze brought with it a sense of restlessness. Arriving at the porch, the front door was ajar, just as when she had been in a hurry. Her heart beat hard while he entered the refuge again. Inside the house, everything was quiet. No sign of man. Marta walked with light steps through the hall, but this time it didn't go to the room or the attic. Something pulled her somewhere else. She found a door at the bottom of the corridor, which once seemed locked. Now it was open, revealing a ladder coming down to the basement. She hesitated, but curiosity was stronger. He slowed slowly, every step ranging under his feet. Upon arriving at the basement, he saw a large, dark room, illuminated only by a small lamp hanging from the ceiling. Around, piles of boxes and old objects covered by cloths. And in the center of the room, an old wooden table with something that looked like a diary. Martha approached the table. The diary was dusty but intact. She opened the first page and saw a woman's careful handwriting. Beatrice, the name signed in the footer. He began reading the first words and realized that it was a disturbing account of Beatrice's last days in the refuge. She wrote about her son, how he was changing, getting weirder every day, like someone else. Beatrice suspected that he had done something terrible, something she could never forgive, but never revealed what it was. The diary ended abruptly, with a last enigmatic phrase. He is gone, but the refuge still keeps his secrets. Martha felt a shiver up her spine. When he closed the diary, he heard a noise behind him. The man was there at the top of the stairs, looking at her, but this time there was no hurry in her movements. He went down slowly, without taking his eyes off her. Now you know, he said, the calm voice, almost resigned. Marta retreated, but the basement seemed smaller with each step. You? Who are you? She asked, her voice shaky. He looked at her without smiling this time. I am what was left. The lights blinked, and in an instant he advanced toward him. The end. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel, like and comment on the story.